And thank you so much, Helga, for that beautiful, beautiful prayer, and also call to recognition for our ancestors and our landscapes and for all the animals that we share space with. So I actually prepared a slideshow that I thought was really snazzy because I used Canva, and it's like got visuals and video and all this fun stuff. And we'll see if it works, but if it doesn't, I'm more than happy to just do my spiel. And then there's a link that I will share with you, and then you can go see the slideshow at your own time. So we'll see if it works, but that's my little disclaimer, because I for some reason I thought we were inside, but I'm so glad we're not inside. This is better, so much better. But we'll see if it works. Okay. And we'll see if I can see it. I'll kind of step forward here. I don't want to block. Can you see, Casey? I don't want to block you. Okay. Can you all see that? Okay, good. Okay. And I don't know how fast it'll go because it saved it as an MP4, which is kind of fun. But yeah, so I'm calling this this talk, and I've done variations of it over the past, I want to say, couple years, just since lockdown, which is called The Importance of Place, Power, and Purpose in Pollinator Conservation. And the power in that sentence really reflects more on the word of responsibility. It's within our power to choose whether to acknowledge our responsibility or to ignore it when it comes to conservation. And so this video actually has some sound to it. Are you all able to connect into the sound on that? As a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer collaborating with peasant farmers in South America. The bees captivated my curious mind, and working in an outdoor office made of fresh air, flowers, and freedom enticed my soul. My nomadic journey as an apiculturist has taken me far from where I could ever have imagined. Having come in New Mexico. My heritage is a mosaic of memories influenced by my Native American ancestors, who instilled in me a profound reverence for place and purpose, and to pursue acts of community service. So I chose to become a bee farmer, as I wanted to continue to learn from Mother Nature and Father Time. As a farmer, I share beekeepers' voices of concern and need for adaptation and innovation to fulfill our dedication for local to global food production. Sharing their challenges, I became encouraged to return to academia to help quantify their observations and advocate for pollinator conservation. Now, as a researcher, my quest to better understand the relationship between cultures, food systems, and stewardship is at the forefront of my thoughts. Honeybees are like some of us and our ancestors, immigrants to this country. They have adapted and become the backbone of agriculture. There are distinct ecotypes or subspecies of honeybees, like races in humans. And these ecotypes carry genetic histories like seeds, which contain their very existence and memories of creation. For within each one, they have the power to nurture and adapt, and the magnificence to create life, food, and medicine for the world. One of the things I most enjoy about beekeeping is that it bridges cultures and goes beyond borders. It connects us to our origins as fellow beings of light, as a part of this land, not separate from it. This magnificence is alluring and inspires me to find and connect with bees and their keepers around the globe. I invite you all to accompany me on my nectar nomad storytelling journey as I chase the bloom, encounter cultures, and follow the liquid starlight known as honey from flora to flavor to feast. So hopefully you could see that well. It's a little 3-minute digital storytelling video I put together during lockdown. I took this online workshop. And at that point in time, I had, was in the process of finishing my master's, which I finally did last May. And wasn't so much trying to reinvent myself, but was trying to recalibrate, you know, find the compass, right, in this world that all of a sudden we all had the rug pulled out from underneath us once we all had to deal with the pandemic and the unknowns that brought. And so I like to play that video through its entirety because my mother is a wind writer. She plays the flute, and so she did the soundtrack for me. So I thank her for that. And really what this comes down to, and I can't really see the slides, but I can kind of see over here, is talking about, you know, I mentioned it, flora, flavor, and feasting, right? A lot of F's, right? But you know, where does that come from? And it comes from, we know the landscape, but where is that landscape, right? And it all comes down to this breath that we need to find, and that our planet finds in the air, which helps to condense moisture, and then that rains back down on us, and or snows, fills our mountains with hopefully some good snowpack, which then slowly over the seasons and the tilt of the planet will then melt and become water, right? And it's that water. Again, thank you, Helga, so much for bringing up this primordial, but also very essential being that we all need to live. And that is a part of us. And so we are living water, just like the waters that run down in the Rio and in the varying streams and the acequias is very much alive. And with that, that water running down creates form. It goes over a body, right? Goes over this earth, comes down from Colorado, goes through our Taos Gorge and actually has carved it over millennia, and then ends up in our valleys and saturating our fields, and then ending up even in our faucets and our bathtubs and our kitchen sinks. And so this primordial being is very much an ancient one, but also very much a living one that is still learning and still flexible enough to be moved or to be manipulated. And so our choices and how we choose to steward our waters are also going to affect how that relates to the landscape and what ends up being or not building soil, right? And that soil really then is what gives rise to this flora, and actually then creates the habitat or the forage or the food that so many organisms depend upon, from bacteria and lichen, right, to not only our bees, but also to cattle and other livestock, and then to us. And our stewardship process of this whole relationship that we are part of really does then come down to a philosophy in terms of what we feel a sense of power or responsibility to. So I have no idea what slide it's on, but I'm going to look. And it's about roots, right? So building roots not only down, but also across and connecting with each other. And creating this sense of culture and community that then we are able to take forward in terms of what are these philosophies now that we want to pass on from one to the other. And so in a sense, what I've learned over time, and that's one of the reasons why I share that little video of my 3-minute life story, because otherwise I'll go on and on and on. And then this happened and then that happened. And then, but like everybody else's individual story, right? It's had its moments of ups and downs. It's had its moments of confusion, and it's had its moments of clarity. And I really have to credit the bees with giving me that opportunity. And their stories are memories, and these memories become experiences that can be passed down. And that basically becomes the script. That's the genetics that is lying behind every single one of us. That's the script that gets told and retold, added on to, and then passed on. And that script gets to play upon a stage, which is our environment, right? And not only that, but the drama that ensues is the behavior that we get to see. That's the performance. And so the cyclical choreography between pollinators and plants is very deep, very profound. I mean, the flowers, to a certain extent, could do what they needed to do without the bees. At least prehistorically they did, because they didn't exist. There were, ferns and other ways in which life kept going. But for some reason, plants decided to start producing flowers, or many of them did. And they use a lot of energy just to create this intoxicating perfume and nectars to entice these other creatures to come and interact with them. And so the plants are talking to us very, very strongly, not only as those who get to witness it, but also in terms of what we decide to grow, or what we decide to cultivate and nurture, and really, I want to say, enrich with a deeper, not only introspection, but relationship. And some people, might be familiar with these types of concepts through varying different elders who have shared their stories over time. And as Helga mentioned, we all have ancestors, and all of our ancestors have come from indigenous peoples, regardless of our race. And some of us, or some of our particular parts of society, have gotten away from that memory, whereas others have stayed really in tune with that memory. And so this whole talk is really hopefully an inspiration to reconnect if you are feeling at a distance, but also to help others reconnect. And as I mentioned before, I have to thank the bees for helping to teach me that. But this memory really does, or the memories that are created that adapt over time, are really something quite interesting, because each one of them is a snapshot in time, but collectively they help to prepare, right? We call it instinct, or we tend to think of it as even something that's innate, intuition, even when we talk about the human form. And these memories are adaptable. They continue to adapt, and they go through evolution. And then, like seeds, they're able to be passed on. So we ourselves are seeds, and I like to call it the bees as seeds experience, where their stories that are being created and their adaptation is then allowing them to continue to grow and to exist in different landscapes. So on a historical side of things, a lot of people tend to think that honeybees in particular, which is how I first got introduced to the broader world of pollinators, are exotics, are not native to Turtle Island. But we actually do have evidence of our own native honeybee. It's actually fossil evidence that's 14 million years old, called Apis mellifera nearctica, which was found in Nevada. And so I like to consider our modern day honeybees as cousins to this ancestor bee, because they were all the same species. They're all Apis mellifera. But of that species, they are one of 20,000 other kinds of species when it comes to bee biodiversity. And honeybees have become this, what I call an exploited poster child in a sense, because we've really overused them in terms of our industrialized progress towards food production. And unfortunately, that's taken a toll on all these other various species of bees too. And here in Turtle Island, North America, we have about 4,000 of those 20,000 different kinds. And here in the American Southwest and the Intermountain region, we have even, I think, close to 1,400, 2,000 of those. So it depends on where you're at, but it's all about water. And if we don't have the water, where are they going to go? And so with these fires that are happening, it's very scary. I'll be honest, I'm concerned it's going to be a repeat of 2011, which was my worst year beekeeping here in New Mexico, when they had the Las Conchas fire, which I didn't even have bees over there. I was 50 miles away in Truchas, but the smoke, the bees can't smell the flowers that well. And then also it chased all the bears down, and they found my bees in the valley. And so I lost 40% that year. And those were examples of just how interconnected we are. I mean, a fire 50 miles away, but yeah, I lost 40% of my flock family that year. And so I'm worried about, what does this mean, right? That was 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And now we're looking at, possibly seeing more of this kind of weather. So I think organizations such as NMCEWL and also you as individuals coming together with other organizations like HMI and like Quivira, and with the Open Space Center, who's opened its doors to us today to share space, are really critical of how we're going to move ahead. And that's one of the other things that I've learned from bees, is just how to work in community. Or I shouldn't say how to work, but the fact that when you work in community, great things can happen, because I'm still learning how to work in community for sure. And it's exciting, and we have different roles. And so the roles that we decide to play at any one time, right, on this stage, with our own script, with our own genetics, and with the environment that then plays on that, which we call epigenetics, is ever unfolding. And so the limits are really boundless. There are no limits. The possibilities are limitless, is what I meant to say. And with that, I feel like it's a moment where, how does that tie back into us, not only in what we do? Because when we look at the larger picture, it's so immense, right? Like any single one of us can't feel like we can stop climate change, but collectively we can work smarter and not harder, and really work in tandem and through biomimicry with our planet. I heard, it was just so timely this morning as I was driving in from Santa Fe, because I had heard this talk before on the radio, but I had forgotten who and where. And then they played it again this morning, and I thought, this is perfect. So Living on Earth, have you guys heard of that series? And there was it was talking about Gaia, Earth, as not only a spirit but also as a living being. And they had an interview with this astronaut named John Gareth. So I'm saying this in case y'all want to look it up, because it's a really cool episode. But he shared that, it wasn't until he was up in space, miles from Earth, that he looked back and he saw for the first time really just what a magnificent masterpiece it is, and that it's a living being. And he said, it's not a hypothesis. It's common sense. He's like, it, you see it. And as a scientist, he said that he found it so strange that it took him to be off Earth to look back and finally see what he felt his body and his mind knew all along, but was really trying to ignore. And so I think that the reason that story stuck with me so much is because it's exactly that. It's these rights of nature. It's the approach to how we look at things, and these varying elders that we have that have promoted these thoughts from our indigenous peoples and our ancestors, but also to, coming towards in modernity in terms of, Aldous Leopold, and then even now Robin Kimmerer, and more folks who are voicing their thoughts about this, because it is a responsibility, a sense of responsibility. And I'm going to leave it at that, because I know my slideshow is wherever it's at. I can't see it, but I'll share the link with you all for those who want who I'm also very excited to meet the full fellow. This is the novel year. This is the secret team. And my paper is really amazing. I also everything and I think you will really, I'll be excited. But also very in the midst of creating history, creating together. And really, collaborating and giving much more for sanity, for health, and for true wealth of the spirit, but also true wealth in preserving these beautiful gems all around us, these trees, the bees. They actually have an apiary back here because the New Mexico Beekeepers Association does their bee certification course here. So when people get a break, you can possibly walk back there. And all these other wonderful environmental, what we want to call sort of elements, but they really are beings. And I'll just leave it with one more thought, because I don't know what time I'm on, so I don't mean to go over. Oh, good. Okay. I don't know how many people heard, but there was recently what they called the water walk. How is it called? And it's a gentleman from the Taos Land Trust, I believe, who wanted to walk from basically he started in Santa Fe, and he was going to walk up to the headwaters of the Rio Grande, and all with the purpose of trying to raise awareness for personhood for the Rio, right? Because if we start to look at decommodifying our resources and actually giving these beings their personhood back, meaning that the fact that they're living beings, then we will treat them much differently. And they have every right to live just as everybody else into perpetuity for whatever that means, right? I'd like to think the Rio's life is much longer than our own, but that really does depend on us and our stewardship and how we approach that. And I think, when it comes to bees, one of the things that I like to share with people, because I got started, back in the late 90s, and just by chance. It wasn't like I grew up knowing I wanted to be a beekeeper. It really just kind of randomly happened. my mom would introduce me to folks and say, oh, my daughter, she's a beekeeper. And people would go, oh, bookkeeper. And the conversation would go on. And it was fine. And then in 2006, colony collapse disorder hit the airwaves, or CCD for short. And everybody's going, it's cell phones, it's pesticides, it's that guy, it's the big ag, it's this, it's, it's all these other people's fault. When really we have to look in the mirror, and it's our collective sort of actions that have made it a more complex situation. There's not a single smoking gun. And so that sort of event, that media event, really put a lot of, I think, bee people in places that they weren't used to be. You tell people you're a beekeeper, and then everybody wants to know, why are the bees dying? Are we going to hell in a handbasket? Yes and yes, but I don't have any answers, just more questions. But if we're gonna go, why not make it a beautiful, glorious one at that, and try and preserve it along the way as much as possible? Not to sound all doom and gloom. I am slightly cynical. You guys will get to, as you get to know me better. I do have that side, but in a sense, this whole effort towards people becoming aware then, right? And people want to become a beekeeper, and it became quite trendy. And albeit for noble intentions, the reality is very different, because what's the point in trying to have more bees if we don't have the habitat for them? And how can you make the habitat for them if we don't have good soil? And how can you have good soil if we don't preserve our waters? So it really is all interconnected. So what I like to share with people now is, we really need people to help build habitat. We really need people to start focusing from the ground up, because all of that is what's going to actually give rise to healthy forage, which will then be nutritious, which will then allow our bees to actually deal with varying ailments. Food is medicine and water is life, right? So with that, I will switch to questions. And I kind of talked here, there, everywhere, but I'll be around all day. And I would encourage you all to plant more flowers if you can.
Thank you so much, Melanie.
You're
Do we have
welcome.
any questions? I've got a mic I can pass around if you want to raise your hand.
I can keep blabbing too.
You've got one? Oh, here we go. Can I go back this far with the mic? Okay.
Hi, Melanie. I'm Lawrence Gallegos with the Western Landowners Alliance, and also with the National Latinos Farmers and Ranchers. But you were saying how water is life, and I think we've all believe that's the case. But do you see some of how the water's been managed in the last say few decades, that that's we need to change, because there's things, and if so, can you elaborate on some of that?
Sure, I will venture into this can of worms, because it's a deep one, isn't it? Yes, I grew up in Cruces. I grew up in the Mesilla Valley. My tribal community, Tortugas Pueblo, is based down in southern New Mexico. And we are not federally recognized, but we are cousins to Isleta and Taos Pueblos, which are federally recognized. And I mentioned Las Cruces because when I grew up as a kid, the Rio Grande you could go swim in it. And in fact, you had to be careful. People drowned or would be whisked away. And now it's a trickle. There's ATV races. And people from up north who have the Rio running all the time don't realize how dry it is downstate. A lot of that gets diverted to Elephant Butte, which then goes to Texas, which then goes, where. And I often think, and I don't say this in a negative way, I say it more out of empathy, pobre Mexicanos, by the time they get the water, it's a drop of how much of it is actually water, how much of it is residue, and the fact that these were all shared spaces and lands. We didn't have these borders, as folks even say, the border crossed us. We didn't cross the border. The monarchs go back and forth. Our peoples, my community, is got established because as folks would come down from the north to get away from the extreme cold, a lot of the elderly or the infirm or folks who liked it warmer stayed. Okay, so even our peoples were nomadic and moved. and followed resources. Our buffaloes did too. And so in that sense, I think with water, what really actually concerns me, and this again, drawing on my youth, was when I grew up in Cruces, of course, I was ready to get the hell out. I was like, this is a small town. We don't have, it's not lively, when you're in your teens and you're like looking for, excitement. And now I go back and I'm like, quit growing, quit growing. It seems like it's turning into almost a gridded Tucson, a smaller version. But in that sense, I see it as what is progress, what is development. We think all these resources are limitless, but they're not, and we're living as if they are limitless, and we can just get bigger and go bolder and make more money. But those resources, and they're not resources, they're beings. They're going to run out. So one of my bigger concerns is actually for the Albuquerque area and the other mini metropolises that we have. I understand the need for having more jobs, but when we're trying to bring in lots of people and more industry here, where are they going to get the water? And not only that, once those folks have children, is there going to be enough for their kids? No, then their kids are going to have to go somewhere else. And so I really see it as this sort of short-term planning, like growth now, but not looking at long-term sustainability, especially with water. So I get very nervous when I see neighborhoods going up, because I'm like, where are they getting the water? Oh my gosh. And I know in New Mexico, we tend to be more water conscious folks, but I think we need to have some deeper conversations with planning and zoning, and also with industry growth, to see how we can do it more mindfully and more sustainably. I'll leave it at that. That's just the top surf. That's only one worm, not the whole can.
Thanks. Have we got any other questions? I think we have time for one more. Hand in the air.
In New Mexico, that was such a cool talk. You're so cool. But in New Mexico, what are the most important crops that are bee pollinated? And then which of those are the most drought tolerant? I'm very late in planting my garden.
Really good question. And I think the sort of hard and fast rules for that are kind of becoming more gray, because, climate's shifting and landscapes are changing. For myself, when I used to take my bees even back to southern New Mexico for part of the year, because my mom was down there, and so I had a place to stay, I would I really like to get the mesquite honey, which usually starts to bloom around Cinco de Mayo, May 5th. And then it started getting drier down there, and Albuquerque started blooming before Cruces, and that was, I think, just because it got 2 bits more water, right? And then in general, and our plants are smart. They're very smart. Especially here in New Mexico, when it rains, everything blooms. So we have a lot of diverse pollens and nectars coming in at once, especially for bees, which is good because it gives them diverse nutrition. It's not just a monocrop ag, which only provides one kind of protein or one kind of pollen, right? When you get up towards the mountains, you'll have some sweet clovers, which are really nice, the white and yellow sweet clovers. There's always alfalfa, but I'll tell you, most alfalfa growers I know like to cut at no more than 20% bloom to retain the protein in the actual forage for their livestock. And that's when the bees don't get those flowers, right? Because then they get cut. So there's a little bit of that. There's some cotton as well. I mean, I'm talking more like cultivars in terms of like ag, quote unquote, commodities. I don't like to use that word, commodities. But in general, it's really having a diversity of blooms that's going to feed them. And I think finding those drought tolerant plants that are in your plant zone. The southern parts of New Mexico can handle more of the Mediterranean and even quote unquote kind of subtropical plants. But then as you get farther north, it's going to get to things that have to be a shorter growing season. So I would just suggest that you plant a variety, and especially if you're wanting stuff for yourself, multi-purpose or dual use plantings are great, because a lot of them are food that we can eat, or aromatics, basils, oreganos, mints. Those are great for pollinators, and then they're also good for us, and they can be stored too.
you know. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank
I'll
you
be
so much,
here.
Melanie. Let's give her another round of applause.
I just have to say, Angie, you put me on the spot because now I have to try and act really cool. I don't feel cool. I'll be honest. I'm an introverted extrovert. People don't believe me when I say I'm shy, but it's more that I get really nervous when I get chatty. And so we were like, "Oh, you're not shy," and I'm like, "No, actually, I'm really shy." But thank you. That was a nice compliment.
Well, we'll be sure to come chat with you during the breaks and everything. Thank you again. We're gonna do a little transition now. I'm gonna hand the mic over to CJ.